Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Jack Ardrey, moderator for today's program, which is brought to you by Charles IT. Charles IT is a leading compliance expert and managed IT service provider in Connecticut. We are recording today's session, so all attendee lines are muted. Attendees will receive an email that provides a copy of the presentation and a link to the recording of today's webinar. Our program will begin with a presentation. Following this presentation, we will have a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the presentation via the Q&A button on your screen. We have a large audience with us today, so our presenter will likely not get to all of your questions, but he will work to follow up on those that he does not have the opportunity to address. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Mike Bailey. Mike is one of Charles IT's compliance experts and team leads. Mike has been working as an IT and security consultant for 18 years now and has an extensive background in DFARS compliance and helping small to mid-sized businesses achieve the necessary requirements to win their DoD contract. His expertise has made him a perfect fit to help guide Charles IT clients who fall under high compliance. I will now turn the floor over to Mike.
Thank you, Jack. Everyone, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to review kind of DFARS and next steps and making sure you're keeping DFARS in focus for your organization if you're required from a compliance standpoint. Overview of topics we're going to cover today is DFARS background, kind of where everything came from, the relationship between DFARS and CMMC, the DFARS regulations which may or may not apply to your organization, how the NIST 800-171 guidelines apply to your organization, the recent developments within the DFARS regulations with the transition to CMMC, DFARS assessments and why they're important for your organization, how to keep DFARS in your focus organizationally and from a risk management perspective, gap assessments. We'll follow up with a Q&A session, as Jack mentioned, and then I'll kind of just give you some closing thoughts. So what is DFARS? DFARS was first published in 2015. The Department of Defense published the Defense Acquisition Federal Regulation Supplement. That's what DFARS stands for. Overall, the intent was to set a consistent minimum baseline of cybersecurity standards to ensure that all DoD vendors are protecting data adequately, really in response to repeated threats and breaches of the DoD supply chain. This initiative was meant to enhance security and ensure confidentiality of controlled unclassified information, that's CUI, across the DIB, which is the Defense Industrial Base, and to minimize the potential for any data breaches. So, ultimately, what is CMMC? CMMC stands for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. It is the DoD's next step response to significant and repeated compromises of sensitive information located within contractors' information systems, such as yourself. With the previous DFARS initiatives that began in 2015 and then later 2017, the DoD found that many contractors were not adhering to the requirements outlined in their contracts, and really many were even misrepresenting their compliance. The contractors realized that there was really no enforcement to the previous regulations and limited oversight. So many of them chose not to invest the resources or money into the changes necessary to become compliant. A lot of contractors did find that they didn't want to spend the money, and they felt that they were losing their competitive advantage in the DIB, so they chose not to move forward. DFARS now includes clauses that outline the plan for the DoD to audit and for third-party assessment. CMMC is built on the NIST 800-171 framework, but it does include additional security controls, so that's important to understand. It's also important that the controls which apply to your organization are dependent on what they're calling the maturity level outlined in your contracts. This is really the sensitivity of data at which you're going to be handling or which will be flowed down to you from the government. Most defense contractors who are working with CUI or controlled unclassified information, it's really expected that you're going to be required to meet the controls at level 3 of the framework. might be asking, where does all this come from? Really, there are going to be clauses that are outlined within your contracts that you have with your government organizations, and they're going to really be outlined such as these right here. DFARS 252, 204, 7008 was really the baseline clause. It requires compliance with safeguarding covered defense information controls. It outlines the requirement to comply with the NIST 800-171 framework, and it also outlines a requirement to follow 252, 204, 7012, which is I'll review in a second coming up. 252, 239, 7010 applies to any organizations which are utilizing cloud computing services for hosting any type of CUI information. It's important to be aware of the requirements for cyber incident reporting, including media preservation and forensic analysis. And many public cloud infrastructures, this is not a capability. So when you look at systems like this for hosting any of your CUI data, you need to make sure that you're following the proper, taking the proper precautions and ensuring that that service will provide media preservation for forensic analysis in the case that you might have a cybersecurity incident. Also be aware that the framework controls still apply fully to all systems in the cloud that you're using. So the DoD has also outlined the FedRAMP moderate baseline as the certification for cloud providers to achieve and demonstrate their compliance with this requirement. So if you are looking at cloud services, you likely want to make sure that they are FedRAMP moderate compliant. The 252, 204, 7012 clause, that outlines the requirement for incident reporting. Incident reporting is if you have any compromises on your network, the government wants them reported to DIBnet. So that's in Defense Industrial Base Net. It's the collaboration platform for defense contractors, and that needs to be done. They call it rapid reporting, but it really needs to be done within 72 hours of the detection of an incident. So that's a pretty quick time frame. It's important to note that also included in this clause that there is a requirement for a medium assurance security certificate. That's really to prove your identity of who you are and the company that you're working for, and you need that to access DIBnet. So that process does take a couple to a few weeks to gain that certificate and to process that with a third-party security authority. So you will likely not be able to have that processed in time if you're looking to procure that certificate at the time of a detected incident, since you only have 72 hours to report that. So make sure you're doing that ahead of time. The 252, 204, 7019, and 7020 clauses, they are new developments over this past year that outline the requirement to meet the NIST 800-171 and to have and perform a risk assessment against that framework to calculate a score and maintain that score for 3 years. So you're going to have to calculate that score based on your assessment. You will then submit that score to the Supplier Performance Risk System, also known as SPRS. There are 3 levels of the assessment. There's a basic assessment, which is your self-assessment against the framework, creation of a system security plan, and also a plan of actions and milestones. That falls under the basic assessment. There's also a medium and high assessment. The medium assessment will be performed directly by the government. They will look to perform a document review. So they'll be looking at your SSP, POAMs, policies, procedures, and they'll just essentially have discussions with the contractor. They'll be looking to just make sure that you kind of have your ducks in a row and make sure things are in place. There is a requirement for you to provide the DoD full access to your facility, systems, and personnel to perform the assessment, but I think that kind of just comes with the territory. And then moving on to the high. The high includes the same thing as the medium. It is performed directly by the government. but it adds that next level of verification. So the DoD is going to be examining and looking for demonstration of implementation of the controls, which are outlined in your system security plan to validate compliance. And then the last clause here that you'd likely be seeing within your contracts are the 7021 clause. That is truly the CMMC requirement clause, ensuring that you're following the cybersecurity maturity model certification requirements. This outlines the requirement for you to have a current CMMC certification. That certification should not be older than 3 years, and that certification would be coming from a third-party certification authority. Also, this clause outlines the requirement for this specific clause to be flowed down to your subcontractors and included in any subcontracts that you assign. It does require that prior to awarding a contract to a subcontractor that you, essentially their prime, are ensuring that the sub has a current CMMC certificate at the CMMC level of the sensitivity of the information that you'll be shared with them. So again, likely at level 3, but note that it is there's responsibility on you if you're going to have subcontractors to ensure that your subs are meeting the same level as the level of the contract that you're performing on. Review the NIST 800-171 control framework and the families there. If you're not familiar with the NIST 800-171, this really is just a high-level breakdown of the requirements. NIST 800-171 does break down the total of 110 controls into different control families, they call them, and these are similar or like requirements that are outlined in the list. Each control family does vary with the number of controls in each. Some of it as little as 3, such as awareness and training or incident response, and then up to 22 controls as with access control. So there is a breakdown of each, and it's just kind of organize everything into their respective families. Few different types of DFARS assessments. The self-assessment is a self-reporting mechanism for gap assessment against the 800-171 framework. It includes the requirement of the completion of a system security plan. System security plan really is your a document of how the controls you've implemented to meet the requirements of the framework are implemented throughout your organization. And it also requires a plan of actions and milestones. So any gaps that were identified from a risk assessment that you performed would be listed on your plan of actions and milestones. Those generally have the deficiency, a plan of how you expect to resolve or close that gap. The owner of that, whether it be administrative, technical, whoever that's going to be, your IT department, your HR department, etc. Physical, security, whatever it may be. And they're going to look for a milestone date. So they want to know different stages of implementation or how you're going to close those gaps and have a realistic date of when those are going to be completed. I generally tend to give recommendations to have those dates be realistic. We want to make sure that they're achieved. We don't want to be making changes to those. You are going to be submitting this to the DoD, so or likely to your primes on questionnaire. So you want to make sure that you're going to stick to those dates and achieve them and show constant progression moving forward with those. Upon performing this self-assessment, you will then be able to calculate a score or a risk score, and then that's going to be reported to the SPRS. Likely many of you have done this already. This requirement was in place end of last year. So if you do currently have any DoD contracts, it was likely expected that you did submit that, perform a self-assessment, submit that score, and hopefully that you're moving forward to closing any of the gaps identified or outlined in your POAM. There is a shift to a third-party certification, or C3PAO. So CMMC did mandate the need for approved third-party assessment organizations. Currently, there are a collection of auditors approved by the DoD, and note that those are specifically approved by the DoD and not just anyone can be a C3PAO. What this really did was define a division between the implementer and the auditor. So it added some separation of the process and minimized potential collusion or misrepresentation of compliance on the part of the contractor. Also note, there is a 5-year staged rollout. So the DoD is implementing a phased rollout. The specific contracts you have, not all of them, will require offerers to meet a specific CMMC level. Again, likely majority contractors dealing with just CUI data will be on CMMC level 3, maturity level 3. Note that the first contracts that will be associated with critical DoD programs and technologies, such as nuclear and missile defense. At that point, those contracts, for those contracts, certification will be used as the basis of a go, no-go decision. So if you're working in those verticals and working on those types of systems, just note that you will likely need to have a CMMC certification awarded to you by a third party in order to either get or maintain those contracts. So expect that to be coming up soon. Currently, the DoD is planning to focus the requirement for the CMMC certification on new contracts and subsequently following up with adding requirements for specific CMMC levels to contract renewals. So as with most government initiatives, this rollout will not happen overnight. As I mentioned, it's going to be a 5-year process, but expect that on or after October 1st, 2025, that CMMC will apply to all DoD solicitations and contracts. So by that date, as a drop dead date, you do need to have that certification performed by a third-party auditor. So just while CMMC is absolutely headed this way, we still do have some time, roughly 5 years, continuing to follow the requirements to ensure that NIST 800-171 compliance is implemented within your organization. So you might ask, like, if you haven't done anything yet, how do you get started? What's the first steps? How, this is a gauntlet. Like, these are some complex clauses. There's a lot of verbiage there that is unclear. Like, you might be overwhelmed. What do I do? What are my next steps? So first thing, always gap assessment. You have to understand where you stand, where your organization stands. Part of that gap assessment really is to identify the scope of your organization. So you're going to start with a gap assessment. You're then going to work on your system security plan and your POAM. And then you're going to follow that up with implementation of the security controls where you did mark any deficiencies or gaps. So that gap assessment, as I mentioned, we're going to start with identifying the scope of any CUI in your environment. The CUI should be identified within your contracts as things that would be, you would be storing, transmitting, or processing. It's going to be anything that you generate also within accordance to the performance of the contract. That gap assessment really is going to have you go through the 110 controls, the NIST 800-171. You're going to identify any deficiencies, and it's really important to think total scope here is if you're looking at something like multi-factor authentication. Does multi-factor authentication apply to every system where CUI resides? Is it just your mail system? Is it just your local computer login? You could say yes to that, but also you need to think of different things such as VPN connections and third-party services, any other hosted systems, etc. So just need to always be thinking about scope when you're looking at that gap assessment. Following out of that gap assessment, you're going to build out a system security plan. Your system security plan is going to define the security controls that you have implemented to achieve each and every control within the environment. It really is your playbook for how you are achieving NIST 800-171 compliance. Also included in that will be a defined scope and interconnects of organizational systems that store, process, or transmit CUI. Everything needs to be included in there. They want to see network diagrams. They want to see important contacts within your systems. And also note that this is required in order to calculate the score for your self-reporting to SPRS. So you're going to utilize this document to then go through, identify where you're compliant, where you're not compliant, fill out those items so that score is generated, and then you can report that to SPRS. Additionally, you're going to have a plan of actions and milestones. What this document is a list of any gaps you identify during the assessment against the 800-171 framework. It's really going to show a risk posture for each respective gap and any mitigating steps that the company intends to make. So everything you identify as not compliant will go into this list. As I spoke about before, you're going to want to identify an owner, any milestones that you will have to achieve implementation and closure of that gap, and you're going to want to outline a milestone date of when you plan to achieve that. And again, I would try to make sure that you're meeting those dates and make them as realistic timelines. The hope is that as you go through and meet those milestones, that items are going to be completed on that list, and it should become a smaller document as you begin to check items off and achieve greater compliance within your organization. And the last step there really is necessary security, administrative, technical controls to close those gaps. For many organizations, these could be, but are not limited to, multi-factor authentication is always a big one. Encryption of your systems, so at rest, so local hard drive encryption, in transit, such as file transfers or email, or even connecting to web-based systems. Security information in event management is another heavy lift item for many organizations. That's your SIM platform. It is log correlation and alerting capabilities. That really goes back to another item we talked about earlier regarding incident response and having information available to the DoD in case of any type of incident reporting. They're going to look for information from your SIM to get a timeline of an event that might have occurred. Risk assessment should be a continuous operation, but implementing a risk assessment capability within the organization. Vulnerability management is very important. Identifying what you are doing to identify vulnerabilities, and then a process to ensure that they are being remediated in a timely fashion. Security awareness training is really one of the pinnacle items for ensuring that your staff are up to date with knowing what they should and shouldn't be doing within the organization, ensuring they're aware of insider threat capabilities, and just making sure that they know and are confident in their abilities to do the right thing within your organization and how to handle data correctly. And then last one is policy and procedure. Policy and procedure for many organizations is a daunting task. Really being able to put all of the requirements of this framework together in a operationally efficient capability so that it's not impacting your organization. So making sure that you're keeping everyone's keeping compliant, but making sure that you're able to operate and again keep your competitive edge without impacting the organization. So that leads us to, realistically, as a defense contractor, you're always going to have to keep DFARS in focus. You're always going to have to be thinking about this, making sure that you are on top of this. What that really means is keep on track with those POAM milestones and deadlines. That should be something that should be reviewed on a regular basis. When you do have that POAM document, make sure that the owners know what their responsibilities are. They know what those deadlines are. If there's any other business units involved that are going to be impacted by the changes in that POAM, make sure they're they're involved and everyone's working together towards the common goal. What you really want to do also is integrate risk assessment into your day-to-day operations. If any new systems are going to be stood up, if any new capabilities are going to be handled within the organization, if you're going to have organizational changes, really need to review what those changes impacts are. Keep the NIST 800-171 in mind throughout all of that, and that could be from technical implementations, also physical security implementations, even down to like HR. So just want to make sure that always, reviewing risk assessment, seeing how your changes are potentially, going to be impacted by your compliance requirements, and if there are going to be deficiencies, ensure that they do get added into your POAM, and your SSP is updated with any of those changes as they occur. And then, last but not least, really, you got to make sure that any previously implemented controls are monitored and maintained. So it's a heavy lift to get these things into place, but once they're in place, they do need maintenance, and you need to be making sure that you're keeping up with them. So that's something you're going to likely have to be able to prove to the auditors when that assessment comes around.
Thank you, Mike, for a highly informative presentation. There were some great points there, great takeaways for DFARS. So we will now begin the Q&A section. As a reminder, submit any questions you have via the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Our presenter will not get to all of your questions, but he will work to follow up on those questions that he does not have the opportunity to address. So that brings us to our first question here. Mike, when will CMMC completely take over for DoD contracts?
Yeah, great question. So realistically, the NIST 800-171 is really always going to continue to be like the backbone for compliance for defense contractors who process, transmit, or store CUI. But as I mentioned, within the next 5 years, CMMC will be expected to be fully implemented for the controls and for the certification by a third party for any defense contractor. So, just note that there is a 5-year rollout plan. We're looking at, October of 2025, which is, did begin last year, and expect that, you should be making taking your steps now to ensure your compliance with NIST 800-171. It's likely expected that you did submit a self-assessment score to the SPRS, and hopefully you've got your SSP and POAM and you're working towards those items. So expect that, continue to move down that track, and, within the October 2025 timeline, look to have an assessment performed by a C3 PAO, and everything should be good. Great.
Leads us to our next question. How often does my system security plan and plan of actions and milestones need to be updated or reviewed?
Great question. Really, technically, your SSP and POAM are living documents. You really should be updating these, well, specifically like your SSP, with any changes that are occurring within the organization as they're implemented. This includes technical control implementation, changes in any type of system scope or interconnection changes, personnel changes that might be listed on there if you have organizational changes or technology changes there. Really, you also want to ensure that you're, as I mentioned, performing regular risk assessments of any changes that are made in the environment, and really, realistically, those will flow down to your POAM if there's any deficiencies. So got to make sure that those are tracked there too. Additionally, the POAM is expected to be updated as any milestones are achieved. As you're implementing any technical items or administrative items to close any of the gaps that you had identified there. So really, those are going to be changing at a constantly, and they should be documents you're very familiar with. And just keep them moving forward, and showing progress is really the key here.
Great. We appreciate it, Mike. Thanks for taking the time to answer those great questions. And that is actually all the time we'll have for questions today. If you submitted a question that was not asked during the Q&A, it will be provided to Mike along with your contact information for a follow-up. And before we conclude, I would like to give Mike an opportunity to share some final thoughts. Mike?
Sure. So realistically, just want to cover, who needs DFARS compliance? And the answer to that is, any defense contractors who are storing, processing, or transmitting CUI. As I mentioned, you will have outlined contractual obligations by the inclusion of those previously mentioned DFARS clauses within any of your contracts from your prime. So, you should be aware of that. Many of your primes are going to be asking you for questionnaires or security assessments on their own outside of this. So just keep that in mind, that if you're getting those, you are likely subject to the DFARS compliance clauses. Keeping DFARS in your organization's focus is super important. You want to really implement risk assessment processes for any internal information technology changes and implementations. Make sure you're keeping up with your POAM milestones and deadlines. Make sure you're keeping your SSP up to date with any implementations or changes that you have. It's just going to make things a lot easier down the road. And Charles IT, we're here to help. Charles IT, we focus on clients with regulatory requirements such as yours. We have proven expertise in implementing solutions that work for defense contractors. Operations and efficiency are really likely important to you and your organization, and ensuring that you maintain your competitive advantage in the DIB marketplace. So if you have any questions, let us know. We're here to help. We've got some great solutions to make sure that you can achieve these requirements very easily. Doing this a long time and something we're really familiar with. So anything we can do to help you out, whether it be just answer some questions or help you with a project, we're here for you.
Thanks again, Mike, for a terrific presentation and taking the time to answer some great questions from our audience. I also want to thank all attendees for taking the time to join us today. Please make sure to follow Charles IT on our social media platforms for information on our upcoming webinars and events. And this officially concludes today's webinar. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great rest of your day, and please stay safe.